a medical experiment. He could no longer bear the pain in his body. The disease he'd been struggling with all these years was too much, and he was willing to do anything to get rid of it. He agreed to participate in a medical experiment that promised a cure. Who knew it would lead to such a gruesome story? The chief engineer of the laboratory, Dr. Lindsay, explained to him that the experiment was to use a new drug that was supposed to block the pain receptors and make the patient feel relief. The drug had been developed several years earlier and had undergone all the necessary tests on animals, and only now it was ready to be tested on humans. He was one of 10 patients who agreed to the experiment. Each of them received an injection of the drug and was placed in a separate room where their health was monitored. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But after a few hours, the participants in the experiment began to notice strange changes in their condition. He began to hallucinate and felt his body losing control. Scary thoughts appeared in his mind, and he began to see his dead relatives, whom he had never seen before. He began to panic, but no one could help him. None of the other participants in the experiment could get through his door because the lab had a door locking system. After a few hours, he lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he found himself in the lab, tied to a bed. Only Dr. Lindsay was in the room, trying to explain to him what had happened. He learned that the drug they were using contained not only drugs, but something else that allowed him to control the thoughts and actions of the participants in the experiment. It was a real, terrible shock to him. He realized that he had been subjected to a terrible and illegal experiment that affected his brain and body. He asked to be released, but Dr. Lindsay refused. She explained that they should monitor his condition for the next few days to make sure he would not harm himself or others. He had to spend his days in this room, tied to the bed with no connection to the outside world. He felt completely helpless and defenseless. He tried to convince Dr. Lindsay and her colleagues that he was feeling better, that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, but they didn't believe him. After a few days, however, something changed. He began to feel stronger. His muscles became stronger, and he felt he could free himself from the bed. He broke free from his restraints and began to run down the hallway, not caring about his condition. He wanted to get out of this lab and never come back. But what he saw when he reached the end of the corridor left him horrified. He saw hundreds of people who were in the same rooms as he was and who were still under the influence of the drug. He realized that he was only one of many victims of this horrible medical experiment. He decided to fight for his freedom and for the freedom of all the other participants in the experiment. He began to rally the people, bringing them together, and eventually they were able to get out of the laboratory and report their horrible conditions to the authority. The experiment was terminated, and Dr. Lindsay was arrested. But that was no longer important to him. He was free, but his life was already forever ruined. He could not forget the horrors he had endured, and he was consumed with hatred and a desire for revenge. He began psychotherapy and tried to get his life back to normal, but no amount of effort helped. His thoughts were filled only with the desire for revenge against Dr. Lindsay and her team. Finally, he decided it was time to act. He hired a mercenary to kill Dr. Lindsay and everyone else in the experiment. He believed it was the only way to get rid of his misery. However, the plan failed. The mercenary was apprehended by the police, and he himself was arrested for solicitation of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and his life ended in prison. He now understood that his desire for revenge had led him to the ultimate tragedy. He could not get his life back, and he could not get back all those who had suffered in the experiment. He understood that his life had become a horror story, warning everyone that even when there seems to be no way out, one should never let evil and the desire for revenge take over. Otherwise, it could lead to terrible consequences that could not be changed. He spent many years in prison, isolated from the world, alone with his thoughts and his desire for revenge. But one day he began to hear voices, whispers that haunted him day and night. These voices told him that he had to break free and get his revenge. He could not understand where these voices were coming from, but they grew louder and more insistent, and he realized he had to obey them. He began to plan his escape. He knew it would be very dangerous, but he was willing to do anything for revenge. He spent months thinking through his plan and preparing for it. Once everything was ready, he began his escape. He broke into his psychiatrist's room and killed her, just as he had planned. But when he tried to leave the hospital, he was caught. He was sentenced to death, and for several years he awaited his execution. Eventually, the day of his execution came, and he was led to death row. But before he was executed, he heard whispers of voices telling him that he could return from the dead and avenge all those who had harmed him. He could not understand where these voices were coming from, but they were so convincing that he believed them. The body was executed, but his soul remained free. He came back to life, becoming a vengeful spirit, and began to hunt down all those who had harmed him in the past. Now he roamed the hospital and killed anyone who crossed his path, including the staff. No one could stop him, and he continued on his path of vengeance until he destroyed everyone who had ever harmed him. But even after he destroyed all his enemies, he found no peace. His spirit remained in the hospital, wandering between empty corridors and rooms, and new victims seeking refuge. Years later, the hospital closed, and the building was abandoned. However, the spirit of the vigilante remained there, in an endless loneliness and madness. Some people who dared to enter the abandoned building claimed that they heard strange sounds and saw a ghost following them. Others reported feeling as if someone was breathing down their necks or feeling cold in the presence of an invisible being. But no one knew what was really behind these strange apparitions, and many speculated that the vengeful spirit still roamed the abandoned hospital, looking for new victims for its endless vengeance. The story became known throughout the country, and many people were afraid to go into the abandoned hospital, even if it was necessary. But the vengeful spirit stayed there in the darkness and continued his endless hunt for all who crossed his path.